Welcome everyone. My name is Patricia Baquedano Lopez. I'm the intern chair of the Center for Latino Policy Research. Today we are honored to have for our seminar series Professor Peter McLaren, and I have a very difficult task to introduce someone who needs no introduction because his name is Peter McLaren. Yet I must try. Professor McLaren is a professor of urban schooling at UCLA's Graduate School of Education and Information Science. He has a worldwide presence as a top academic and intellectual, but also as a catalyst for inspiring, pushing change, and influencing policy. Professor McLaren will talk today on a title, Ideas on Critical Pedagogy and Revolutionary Praxis in the Age of Imperialism. Professor McLaren's work extends beyond the field of education to social, anthropological, and critical theories. He is the author, co-author, editor, co-editor, author of approximately, I'll just stop there, you can imagine, right? 40 books, hundreds of articles, chapters, interviews, commentaries, interviews. I keep repeating this because it's just so much material, right? Which have appeared in dozens of journals, books, edited collections. Some of these titles include, and I will just read a few to give you an idea of the range of topics. His newer book with Professor Natalia Jaramillo, Pedagogy and Praxis in the Age of Empire, Rage and Hope, Capitalists and Conquerors, Teaching against Global Capitalism and the New Imperialism, Red Seminars, Radical Excursions into Educational Theory, Cultural Politics and Pedagogy, Marxism against Postmodernism and Educational Theory, Che Guevara, Paulo Freire and the Pedagogy of Revolution, Revolutionary Multiculturalism, Counter-Narratives, Critical Pedagogy and Predatory Culture. These are all materials that are and should continue to be part of the educational curriculum across universities, schools throughout the world. Professor McLaren's work in Latin America is most compelling. He has the heart and the smarts to understand how a history of continued oppression and racialization prevents full citizenship and transformative change. His work in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico is unique. Today, la Fundación McLaren de Pedagogía Crítica has developed and has generated a lot of knowledge about Peter McLaren's work throughout Mexico and promotes projects in critical pedagogy and popular education. Above all, Peter McLaren is a teacher in the full sense of the word. He gives generously, and he is a lifelong learner. And so in one thought, he practices his pedagogy. Please join me in welcoming Peter McLaren.
Thank you. I'm just going to raise this just a bit.
That's just pretty short.
Raising the bar.
Raising.
That's a Peter move, right?
Yeah. Is that okay for the... Okay. Well, thank you for that wonderful and generous, overly generous introduction. I wish I could always practice my pedagogy. I'm going to talk to you today from a prepared text. I brought a text with me because you never know, the audience. Some people might want to get some clarification of some conceptual idea that I've been working on or others have been working on. And other people might be here to listen to some general information about critical pedagogy. So I'm going to try to reach out and give a very broad talk. It might seem a little bit eclectic. It will be a little bit eclectic. And I've decided to focus on questions around decolonizing education, issues around race and class, but class in particular. I'm speaking as a Marxist humanist, and my work is driven by class struggle, and often issues around multiculturalism and projects having to do with anti-racism don't fully factor in class struggle. And often I'm accused of reducing race to class or totalizing, the concept of class. And I want to answer some of those charges in my talk. So we can have a lively discussion afterwards. I can stay as long as it's permissible for me to be here. I don't know when we have to exit the room. I'm going to talk for approximately an hour. I might go a little bit over. And if I find that I'm going to go a little bit over, I'll just skip some stuff. And we'll try to get to it in the question and answer section. How does that sound? All right? Okay. I want to start out by reading you a quotation from Bill O'Reilly of the O'Reilly Factor. I've been documenting a lot of O'Reilly-isms in my work, and this is one of my favorites. But you understand what the New York Times wants and the far left want? They want to break down the white Christian male power structure, which you're a part, and so am I. And they want to bring in millions of foreign nationals to basically break down the structure that we have. In that regard, Pat Buchanan is right. And that was Bill O'Reilly, and that was 5/30/07, roughly, at least that's when I downloaded this, talking to John McCain about the immigration bill. Kind of frames, that'll sort of be a kind of backdrop, a backcloth to some of the stuff that I'll be talking about later on. Urban educators carry out their work in schools at a time in world history that's difficult to ignore, let alone imagine. Capitalism functioning as if it has an inbuilt drive to spawn a cruel progeny of ill-tempered bankers and corporate accountants has become more and more organically integrated into a world system and increasingly predatory as the unfolding global recession and subprime crisis continues to reveal. But the problem is not so much dissolute CEOs who abominate the masses or the empire of greed in which they live. The problem is the capitalist system itself, in which those who have to sell their labor power are part of one class. The class that produces the surplus value capitalism needs to sustain itself, and those who purchase human labor and take the profit away from labor, they're part of the other class, the ruling class or the capitalist class. It's Gold and Feldman write, global capitalism operates across continents and has created an international division of labor. Yet despite its highly socialized character, the system is founded on private ownership of the means of production and the alienation of the workforce from the fruits of their labor. Capitalism produces commodities for profit from markets instead of need, and so compels consumers to buy what they do not necessarily need or want, or cannot in reality afford, through extensive credit and debt arrangements. Capitalism talks about peace. It maintains a military-industrial complex complete with vast armies directed at developing countries and domestic populations alike. Capitalism is in sum an alienating, irrational system that poses a danger to the future of humanity. The state of the world looks irrepressibly bleak. So-called Western democracies, the corporate media continue to function in the interest of the transnational capitalist class. The war in Iraq has not ceased to bring its wretched havoc into the pockmarked streets of the Middle East. throughout the Middle East. And the influence of U.S. Christian conservatives can be seen in the growing media attention recently paid to huckster politicians. Mitt Romney, Mike Huckabee, a feckless cabal of Christian right pro-family activists increasingly continue to stoke nativist sentiments and pander to fears about Latino immigration at home and Muslim immigration in places like Europe, which they claim is facing a, and this is the term they use, demographic winter. We're facing a demographic winter unless the white population produces enough babies to achieve what they call replacement level fertility. Amazing. Amazing. George W. Bush's presidential term, of course, is drawing to an ignoble close, like a gangrene-ridden wound in the soul of a country being stapled shut by some kind of back alley physician. But he continues to apprise himself of what little time he has left to wreak as much havoc as he can. Currently, according to a description taken from an Office of the Americas pamphlet, I often will take quotations from pamphlets. They often provide the best quotations you can find. Currently, our head torturer is a missionary to the Middle East and begging weaker nations to assist him in his desire to massacre the children of Iran, as he has massacred the children of Iraq. Jesus has words for President Bush when he said, "Alas, you hypocrites, you travel over land and sea to make a single convert, and when you have him, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are." Matthew 23:13. And as for the academy in these dark times, postmodern theory and anti-referential writing remain in vogue as the most fashionable form of apostasy undertaken by left-wing social critics and social justice educators. And for those that know a little bit about my writing, you'll understand what I mean by anti-referential writing. I'm talking about the post-structuralist surge, the postmodern theory. What's really interesting, I mean, you think about the rewriting of issues around material inequality and injustice, rewriting them as cultural. Right? Rewriting the material as cultural, as if they're simply cultural events, uprooting them from the material. Teresa Ebert and Masoud Savarzada have said that culture is no longer an explanatory concept, but a figure that intervenes in itself and rids itself of commitment. Not all of cultural studies, of course, does this. I'm not taking a shot at all of cultural studies, but some of cultural studies. Its politics becomes politics in the last instance, which, like Althusser's moment of economic determination, will never arrive. It's kind of a politic, it's a politics where politics never really arrives. It's always displaced, right? It's always displaced. The unburdening of culture from culture is intensified in the linguistic turn within the cultural turn by theorizing culture as a form of writing. Culture is spacing, culture is difference, culture is singularity. In the cultural turn, in the linguistic term, culture is a textuality of the negative, a site of meaningfulness without meaning, and thoughtfulness, and thoughtful unthoughtfulness. It would be naive to assume there's no connection between the opacity of capital's system of exchange and the expansion of imperialism in this era of neoliberal globalization, and the politics of representation that's now reigning in the humanities and in the arts. Let's take the case, for instance, of abstract expressionism in painting. Just look at the history of that. Not only did Nelson Rockefeller describe abstract expressionism as free enterprise painting. I mean, I like some of abstract expressionism, don't get me wrong. Of course, there's conceptual aesthetics that are quite marvelous. However, but the CIA used it as part of its Cold War tactics against socialism and its cultural expressions. In the same time, support was given to cultural criticism and anti-referential writing by the CIA. As Ebert and Savarzada have noted, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, the main site for the popular dissemination of post-war abstract expressionism, was a close collaborator with the CIA in advancing the cause of the indeterminacy of the sign. on behalf of capitalism and in fighting against socialism. State support of self-mimesis, art about its own nomadic signs, through the CIA and its various cultural institutions on behalf of capitalism, goes beyond support for a particular school or textuality or art. And support for apolitical theories of art and apolitical intellectuals who disseminate them. The cultural turn is above all about, and I'm quoting here, an interpretive strategy that represents the world as a textuality without text, activities without reference, objects without objectivity. The anti-mimetic text is a response to a need. Ebert and Zavarzada write. Capital after the Bretton Woods Agreement, which founded the financial ground for globalization. Capitalism needed more agile, effective, and aggressive discursive practices to normalize its social contradictions on a global level. Anti-mimetic art blanks out these contradictions in an orgy of the singularity of signs, whose abundance of color, meanings, exceeds all representations and becomes a performativity of the impossible, which reflexively becomes the only possible subject of discourse. It dismantles the old reference theories by marking them as residues of a metaphysics of presence. And that's about as far as into literary theory that I'll get today. What about neoliberal globalization? A few comments about that. It's interesting. Neoliberal globalization has brought about a transformation in work conditions and new ways of rationalizing labor that focuses on a distinction between the time owned by the workers and the employer's time. A shift that collapses private life into the public sphere. I'll give you one example of this. Describing the supermarket chain Asada, now owned by Walmart. Coldry reports on the permanent monitoring of staff who were exhorted to exhibit, quote, miles of smiles that had to be a real smile and to live the Asada family values. Work-based surveillance is used to monitor every aspect of performance, including the length of the toilet breaks. Value is placed on assurance that the performance's features will be reproduced beyond the necessarily limited moment of active surveillance. In other words, what they really want to purchase, and when they're purchasing the labor power of workers, they're actually purchasing the value of authenticity. They're actually purchasing and requiring what they call deep acting, based on internalization of the performance norms of the job as natural. Right? Deep act. They want to see if you're smiling. They want to see if you're exhibiting those miles of smiles, even when you're not in that space where you're, encountering, the public. They want to see if you've internalized that, even in your own private life. In describing the emotional labor required of service sector employees, Coldry cites the chair of the UK Call Centre Managers Association, who notes service sector employers are increasingly demanding that their employees deep act, work on, and change their feelings to match the display required by the labor process. Now, popular culture. As you see, this is quite eclectic. Popular culture provides a dominant philosophy because popular culture is the site, right, where capital sort of organically helps to shape ideologies and subjectivities. Popular culture provides a dominant philosophy that provides workers with consciousness skills that positions them to accept their workplace fate. Again, as Ebert and Zavarzada note, for the labor force to do its job, it not only has to be highly proficient technically, but also have a particular set of consciousness skills, which teach workers how to interpret the world in such a way as to legitimize capitalism. Legitimation is always indirectly through personal beliefs that are constructed so as to seem to have come from within. For example, belief in hard work, belief in private property, belief in a power hierarchy, belief in common sense, belief in the importance of family in particular ways that we stress family importance, and the reverence for the military. These consciousness skills are taught with varying degrees of subtlety in our schools, in the media, church, the family, and other channels of ideology. They're grounded in the dominant philosophy, which is itself an expression of the social relations of production. Ultimate ideological goal of these consciousness skills is to position workers through the innumerable cultural intermediaries of films, novels, music, and sports in such a relation to the social world that they accept the exchange of their wages for their labor power as an equal and fair exchange, and in effect consent to their own exploitation, seeing it as a natural part of that exchange. And that's Ebert and Salazar. Well, what's needed, obviously, it seems to me, is a very different set of consciousness skills than taught by the pedagogical processes of popular culture, what I would call perpetual pedagogy. I see the media primarily as a form of perpetual pedagogy, perpetual teaching, perpetual learning. Those offered by our postmodern apostates do little to provide these skills. Students and teachers armed with postmodern flexible identities that can decenter normative values carried by mainstream discourses are certainly not going to gain much ground against the great juggernaut of capital. Wearing your hat backwards or text messaging profanities about the floor supervisor are not going to be sufficient. Ebert and Zabarzada proclaim what people need is not more cultural identities, but equal economic access. What we need are teachers who understand how value is produced by labor within capitalist societies and who can work actively to bring about the demise of capital. Teachers and students reflexively armed with critical pedagogy must not only resist this form of ideological warfare, but must work towards a vision of a new social, material, and economic conditions out of which can be built new forms of humanist and humanizing subjectivity. And this means struggling for a post-capitalist alternative to capital's value form. In other words, a socialist alternative. David Harvey has argued that the ascendancy of neoliberalism, usually attributed to Thatcher and Reagan in the 1980s, had to be accomplished by popular democratic consent. He writes that for a shift of this magnitude to occur required the prior construction of political consent across a sufficiently large spectrum of the population to win elections. The mobilization and political support for neoliberal economic policies by the transnational capitalist class was accompanied by an assault on Keynesian-inspired state intervention and trade union power. It was followed by the steady erosion of democratic means for popular participation in the workings of state power and a malignant attempt to contain spaces of resistance within the public sphere. And while much of the educational establishment has truckled to right-wing ideology and the draconian programs that dictate the social interests of the neoliberal elite, leftist educationalists have assumed contrarian positions animated by a spectrum of political attitudes, often of unmoored vagueness. Yes, exponents of the educational left want social justice and the empowerment of the working class. You've all heard that. What does that mean, after all? Unlike the fraternal solidarity of the working class boys sharing a penny dreadful after the 14-hour shift in a cotton factory during the days of industrial capitalism, today's working class youth are kept fragmented by internet culture and a politics of conspicuous consumption. That's not all that happens. We've got a lot of youth activists doing wonderful work using media, obviously. But that's what happens to a lot. So many social justice leftists have, quite unimpeded, opted to give these youth more consumer options according to the political contingencies available in the marketplace. Let's give them more consumer options. Is this liberation? Some of these same radical educators feel that since neoliberalism demands so many unpredictable company layoffs, that distance learning now is the way to empower students, suddenly made maladroit by an unstable economy. Hence, they dedicate themselves to helping students get retrained in a competitive and insecure marketplace. Well, is this liberation? Accordingly, some of these self-same educators want students to resist or decenter or to trouble the hegemonic discourses and discursive orthodoxies that marry them ideologically to the apparatuses of the state and that naturalize global institutional apparatuses such as the World Bank and the World Monetary Fund. Well, this is of signal importance, yes, I agree. Yeah, that's important. But without addressing the social causes and deep-seated structural determinations at the roots of capitalist exploitation, can we describe it as liberation? As neoliberalism creates conditions that exacerbate racialized forms of exploitation, both in terms of the social relations of production and the creation of standards-based and high-stakes testing regimes. Some educators are calling for racially sensitive curricula and school policies and practices that will help promote an equality of educational outcomes. This is a fundamentally important step, but by itself will it lead indeed to liberation? Questions I just wanted to lay out. These are just questions. Well, I've got perspectives on globalization. I'm going to move beyond these, but I can come back to them if I have a question in the question and answer session. I'm not sure how. Let me just wax extemporaneously about this then, rather than read my notes. There's a strong theory of globalization, and there's different theories of globalization. We've entered a brand new kind of economy, and that the old Marxist categories are not pertinent, and that really the state has weakened in its ability to contest the movement of capital, etc. And then there's a version of globalization which says no, the state is very strong, still very strong. It still is functionally imperative. It's functionally imperative for the state apparatus to move capital, to place constraints on capital, to help capital achieve its ends in various ways. And that's the perspective of globalization that I ascribe to. Now that might become important to expand on later on in our discussion, but I just wanted to throw that out right now. The issue of state power is a powerful, powerful issue right now. I've been working in Venezuela with Chavistas for a think tank, Centro Internacional Miranda, which is a Chavista think tank in Caracas. I've been working there with Patricia mentioned Professor Natalia Jaramillo, and we've been doing some work there with the missions, the educational missions, Mission Robinson, for instance. And in our travels throughout Latin America, we've come upon groups that are debating, a book by John Holloway, How to Take Power, how to change the world without taking power. I think that's it. That you can't take state power, because if you take state power, you're always going to be in a position of power over people. We want to be in a position of power with people, right, instead of power over people. And then, of course, the Chavistas have a different perspective about the state. Maybe the state can be built from the bottom up. Maybe that's what socialism for the 21st century is all about. Maybe we shouldn't give up seizing state power. And the first position, of course, is charted out by the Zapatistas. And Holloway has been critiqued by the Zapatistas, but largely speaking, I guess he's the kind of, he takes what he learns from Zapatista philosophy and writes it up from a kind of autonomous Marxist position. as an academic text. And a lot of people are really into Holloway's work. Zapatista, driven social movements, and anarchists, largely speaking. And of course, the Chavistas chart out their own position and are quite critical of Holloway. And these are issues that are really important because they speak to the issue of organization. Is it possible to organize for socialism within state apparatuses? Is it possible to remake the state from the bottom up using direct democracy, right? Direct democracy. And these are some of the challenges now that the Chavez government are facing. On the think tank, it's really interesting because this think tank has all kinds of objectives. And human development is one, for instance. A lot of revolutions in the past failed because they didn't put enough emphasis on human development. There was a belief that changing the social relations of production would simply do everything, and everything else would just sort of fall into place. So there are people looking at human development. My friend Mike Leibowitz, Marxist economist from Simon Fraser University in Canada, and Marta Harnecker is looking at how do you develop organizations that actually promote and sustain direct democracy and participatory democracy. And one of the other objectives is critical pedagogy. Now, can you imagine, a government putting critical pedagogy as a priority as part of ushering in the revolution? I think that's quite amazing. Well, here I want to raise two fundamental questions. And the question that I often raise in my work is a question that was posed by Henry Giroux years and years ago, and that is, every student has a right to ask the question, what has society made of me that I no longer want to be? What has society made of me that I no longer want to be? And in order to answer that question, it seems to me that you need to have some sense of how you were formed, right? I mean, how has your subjectivity, right? How has your agency, your human agency, been created? You need some kind of language in order to be able to answer that question. You have to have some kind of language of understanding of subjectivity and how it's constructed, and how you might construct, co-construct, right, your sense of human agency, your sense of positionality in, on, against, and alongside the world. And that's an important question. And another important question, of course, is the question that people always ask, and that is, who are you? The question, who are you? It's the question, who are you? We ask this question in education and pedagogy all the time. Well, who are you? Who am I? And it seems to me that that's a question that's important to answer. But the question, who are you, presupposes an epistemological response. Who are you, Peter? Well, okay, I'm a Canadian, American, white male, critical educator. How do you position yourself? How do you, those questions are, who are you? How do you understand how your patriarchy was, how you're embedded in patriarchal social relations, and how you're embedded in the contradictions of capitalism in ways that you aren't aware of? These are, of course, important questions, but they demand an epistemological response. Before you ask the question, who are you? Critical educators, at least revolutionary critical educators, ask the question, where are you? Because the question, where are you, demands an ethical response. And the question, where are you, demands an answer. And that answer is, I'm here, and I'm here with you. I'm not here for you. You can be there for yourselves. You don't need me. But I'm here and I'm here with you. I'm here and I'm here in solidarity with you. And that's the question that is the question that's first raised in revolutionary critical pedagogy. It's the question, when a naked voice cries out in the wilderness for help, you don't ask for identity papers. You say, here I am. I'm here with you, not for you, not speaking for you. You got your own voice, you can speak for that, and I can try to help create the conditions for that voice to be heard if it's within my power to do so, but it's your voice. But I'm here, and I'm here with you. So ethics precedes epistemology, at least in trying to articulate critical pedagogy at the beginning. Right? Now, the next question is, what does it mean when so-called democratic states refuse to let teachers challenge the economic systems that underpin them? What does it mean when so-called democratic states refuse to let teachers challenge the economic systems that underpin them? The separation between social justice and economic justice is one of the hallmarks of our global capitalist society, especially in established countries, especially in the United States, especially in the United States. You can talk about social justice, kind of. You can use the term. Well, you couldn't in New York just a few years ago. I remember when Giuliani was mayor. I mean, my friend Joe Kinchlow was giving a talk somewhere in New York City, and Giuliani's educational sort of henchman came over and told him he couldn't use the term social justice, one of his talks. But usually you can use the term social justice, but you can't use the term economic justice. You can't use the term economic justice. It's really interesting. I wanted to show you something. I mean, here. Right? Pretend this is a cake. Pretend this is a cake, right? And there's a little sliver in the cake. And this is all based on John Rawls' theory of social justice, theory of justice, right? As long as that little sliver expands by like a micro milligram, right? Then social justice is occurring. Even if like 99.999% of the cake is owned by the rich in the ruling class, if poor people make a little bit of headway, then that's social justice. Social justice based on shares of the cake. It's absolutely obscene. And that's where you get the trickle down, you know, the notion of trickle down, voodoo economics, etc., etc. You can't talk about economic justice in the United States. You're allowed to talk about human rights, but you can't talk about economic rights. Economic justice is for many politicians here in the U.S. just another word for socialism. And given the history of the Cold War here in the U.S., socialism is just a substitute word for the evils of totalitarian communism. Inroads to teaching youth about socialism have always been difficult to create. But post-September the 11th, 2001, they've been well nigh impossible. As fellow Canadian Naomi Klein tells us, we were informed in no uncertain terms by the Bush administration that after September the 11th, 2001, which was designated as year zero, history had to begin over again. We were basically told history now begins. We begin from year zero, September the 11th, 2001. Whatever happened prior to this date didn't matter. History had to be rebooted, like a computer, with all the files prior to September the 11th erased as irrelevant to the immediate goals of the United States. And what are those immediate goals? Right? Fighting terrorist evildoers and creating a war economy in order to be able to increase corporate wealth. All of the work by social movements that had been gaining momentum before 9/11 was immediately halted. This especially concerns us as researchers who work with contemporary youth, since one of the projects that animates our work is to develop post-capitalist possibilities of living on this deeply endangered planet. Work by eco-socialists, work by environmentalists, animal rights activists. Klein reminds us of another September the 11th, this time in 1973, when Chile's President Salvador Allende was killed during a US-sponsored coup led by General Augusto Pinochet. Publicly, the US maintained that Allende and his party were going to install a totalitarian communist regime in Chile. Privately, however, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger told President Nixon, and this quotation comes from Naomi Klein, quote, "The example of a successful elected Marxist government in Chile would surely have an impact on and even precedent value for other parts of the world. The imitative spread of similar phenomena elsewhere would in turn significantly affect the world balance and our own position in it. End of quotation. Thus Allende had to be destroyed. Since that time, the United States has made sure no socialist government would prevail anywhere in the world, such that it could serve as a shining alternative to capitalism. That's really interesting because I remember when Professor Natalia Jaramillo and I were in Caracas, and we were in one Barrio La Vega Sector B, and we were listening to a discussion of people from the barrio in this program, educational program. They were talking about September the 11th, and I thought, wow, this is going to be real interesting. And I've got my pen poised, you know. They're discussing here in Caracas, September the 11th. No mention was made of the U.S. It was Chile. It was Chile, September the 11th, when Allende fell. And the U.S. was not even mentioned in the discussion, which was interesting. I think that was for yesterday, for the day, thanks. I think that was for the next day. But it's interesting it didn't come up as the first, you know, marker. Well, you know, capitalism and democracy are like two thieves planning a joint robbery and simultaneously attempting to steal the spoils from each other. In light of the Bush administration's humanitarian invasion of Iraq and other U.S. war crimes, too numerous to mention, we must detach from the term democracy the connotations of equality and self-rule with which it's been saddled over the decades, and recognize it as a condition that ensures the involuntary servitude of wage labor, the racial and gender division of labor, and the plundering of natural resources by the imperial powers. The once grand refusal of critical pedagogy, and I'm going to be critical of critical pedagogy, the once grand refusal of critical pedagogy to reproduce dominant ideologies and practices inherent in capitalist schooling in the wider context of globalized capitalism, and instead to embrace the possibility of decolonizing the conceptual, the philosophical, the epistemological, and the cultural dimensions of learning, has been expurgated by the flatlined anti-politics of postmodernism. Class struggle has been rewritten in the aerosol terminology of the politics of difference. I'm talking here about multiculturalism. And difference here is treated as difference within itself. How difference is different from itself. So such a move flattens out and empties the whole structure of antagonism or ensemble of relations of opposition within the structured hierarchy of capitalist social relations. Social relations of oppression are dissolved simply into difference within or difference between two differences, into relations of supplementarity rather than highlighting labor relations or struggles between workers and the capitalist class. Before understanding what has been, because understanding what has been often means arming yourself with discourses inaugurated long after the events that you wish to understand have already occurred. Some critics have argued that what's already happened, right, in the past, always springs from the future, right, because we always use a language or discourse, right, to understand it after the event occurred. So people are always saying, what's already happened always springs from the future. That history is governed by the future. Some refer to it as the future anterior, or the future located in the past, and related to a nascent future, or the supposition of a future that occurs beyond the future. Since the future can always lay claim to the latest language of interpretation. You know, have you ever heard the phrase, if you aren't living in the future, you're behind the times? And this has often put such critics in a state of political paralysis because they're afraid of using currently available languages at their disposal to understand present-day conditions. You know, people like, I mean, when I talk a Marxist terminology, they just go nuts. They're like, Peter, you know, I had people say, nobody's, you know, I've had friends say to me, I've been writing as a Marxist since 1994. And people say, oh, Peter, you know, nobody's going to read your work anymore, and you're going to be seen as a dinosaur, and And this is such ancient terminology. I mean, we've got all these new sort of postmodern theoretical mechanisms at our disposal, and theoretical, artifices, and we should incorporate those in work. And people are just afraid. They have to use. They're like almost fashionistas. They like theoretical fashionistas. They actually have to have the latest sort of theory before they're comfortable with articulating something or putting it into print or using it. They're fearful that there might be a theory lingering right around the corner that will render their analysis moot, if not nullify it, right? So part of the problem is that such educators have been taught that academic theory should be detached from world historical struggles that involve more than simply the squabbles that academics have between themselves. So a lot of people, they're not, because they feel like, my theories are, God, I can't talk about world historical events because the theories I'm using might not be in vogue. So let's just not connect what we do as educators to really important issues that are out there, right? Like genocide, or like, neoliberal capitalist exploitation. They choose not to do that. And until the theory emerges that explains everything, they prefer not to link their own teaching and scholarship to the messy terrain of political struggle and how their work as scholars and teachers might be insinuated in the politics of imperialism or coloniality. We'll be talking a little bit about that in wonderful work by Ramon Grosfugel, who's a professor here who does some really good stuff. I'll be talking about his work a little bit later. I'm learning a lot from him. Well, while they seem unsure as to where they should be headed, they do know where they don't want to go. As a Cheshire cat put it in Alice in Wonderland, remember? If you do not know where you are going, any road will take you there. There's also another reason for the political quietude of many contemporary education scholars. And it can be traced to the motivated amnesia of many North American academics about how notions of objectivity and impartiality can be traced to the legacy of Western colonialism. Ramon Grosfugel points out that it was René Descartes, the founder of modern Western philosophy, who shook the theopolitics of knowledge of the Middle Ages at its base when he replaced God with man as the foundation of knowledge. According to Grosfugel, and I quote, "All the attributes of God are now extrapolated to Western man. Universal truth beyond time and space, privileged access to the laws of the universe, and the capacity to produce scientific knowledge and theory is now placed in the mind of Western man. The Cartesian ego cogito, I think, therefore I am, is the foundation of modern Western sciences. By producing a dualism between mind and body, and between mind and nature, Descartes was able to claim a non-situated, universal, God's eye view knowledge." This is what the Colombian philosopher Santiago Castro Gomez called the point zero perspective of Eurocentric philosophies. The point zero is the point of view that hides and conceals itself as being beyond a particular point of view. That is, the point of view that represents itself as being without a point of view. It is this God's eye view that always hides its local and particular perspective under an abstract universalism. Western philosophy privileges ego politics of knowledge over the geopolitics of knowledge and the body politics of knowledge. And that's a quotation from Ramon Grosfugel. It's interesting because I was, this is kind of crazy. I was in Vienna last week. It's just been a crazy time. I was in Thailand 2 weeks ago, got picked up by an elephant who got too close to it and put me over its head 4 times. But it was okay. It was a long story. I asked for it. And I was in Vienna, and I was invited to go in with Professor Juha Soranto from Finland and Professor Haramio to talk about critical pedagogy with a group of scholars in the dance quarter of the museum section of Vienna. And there were fascinating people there, a lot from Serbia, Russia. There was a guy from Holland. And it was an interesting international group who were artists, playwrights, dancers, professors, intellectuals, activists. And one of the members of the group just insisted that, well, the theme of the conference was auto-education, self-education. And one of the organizers was very, very convinced that education should not have a political perspective. It should be neutral. Shouldn't be any politics. And every time I spoke, he got really angry at me. And it was obvious he didn't like me much, and I'm sure he wished he hadn't invited me. But it was this, and it was interesting because he wasn't in education. He was, I think, an entrepreneur, but had an interest in education, and just couldn't get past this idea that there isn't really, a God's eye view, right? That everything is populated with other people's intentions, and all knowledge is political and insinuated in the messy web of ideology. And it was uncanny. Well, it's often the arrogance of the North American scholar that leads him or her to believe not only that knowledge is immune from the structured antagonisms of geopolitics, gender, and class struggle, but that there is such a thing as a state of universal consciousness that is coterminous with the intellectuals who represent the advanced guard of Western civilization. And this is another quotation by Grossvogel, which I think is very powerful. This has allowed Western man, the gendered term is intentionally used here, to represent his knowledge as the only one capable of achieving a universal consciousness, and to dismiss non-Western knowledge as particularistic and, thus, unable to achieve universality. However, as Enrique Dussel has reminded us, the Cartesian ego cogito, I think, therefore I am, was preceded by 150 years since the beginnings of European colonial expansion in 1492, the European ego conquistas. I conquer, therefore I am. The social, economic, political, and historical conditions of possibility for a subject to assume the arrogance of becoming godlike and put himself as the foundation of all truthful knowledge was the imperial being. That is the subjectivity of those who are at the center of the world because they've already conquered it. Well, what are the decolonial implications of this epistemological critique to our knowledge production and to our concept of the world system? It's not an accident the conceptualization of the world system from decolonial perspectives of the South will question its traditional conceptualizations produced by thinkers from the North, and that's the end of the quotation. Well, radical educators, on the other hand, don't struggle in some absolute elsewhere, lamenting our having missed the rendezvous with impartial truth at the top of Mount Olympus. They've named the destination for humanity, socialism, for the 21st century, a struggle for a post-capitalist society. For critical educators, teaching critically as a way of decolonizing democracy means refusing to ensure the supremacy of international financial capital, a commitment to troubling the investment and market prerogatives of transnational corporations, and putting them under popular control of the people. Revolutionary critical pedagogy operates from an understanding that the basis of education is political and that spaces need to be created where students can imagine a different world outside of capital's law of value, i.e. the social form of labor. We're talking about wage labor. Where alternatives to capitalism, capitalist institutions can be discussed and debated, where dialogue can occur about why so many revolutions in past history turned into their opposite. It looks to create a world where we can put to rest the deeply alienated nature of most working conditions, where a new mode of distribution can prevail not based on socially necessary labor time, but on actual labor time, where alienated human relations are subsumed by authentically transparent ones, where new skills and knowledges can be developed that lead to self-development, where freely associated individuals can successfully work toward a permanent revolution, and where the division between mental and manual labor can be abolished, where patriarchal relations, racial antagonisms, and other privileging hierarchies of oppression and exploitation can be ended, and when we can truly exercise the principle from each according to his or her ability, and to each according to his or her need. Where we can traverse the terrain of universal rights unburdened by necessity, moving sensuously, fluidly within that ontological space where subjectivity is exercised. Man, how? As a form of capacity building. That's how it's defined in Venezuela with the Chavistas. Capacity building. Right? What are the cultural formations and structural foundations and social relations of production that best enable our human capacities to be developed? What are they? Commodity capitalism? How do we create spaces, right? Cultural spaces, cultural formations, social relations, institutional structures, social relations of production that best enable capacity building, the creation of human capacities, human possibilities. Could you hold on to that just for a second? Just one second. I promise to get right to you in a second. Because we recognize that a break in the socialization process is necessary, and our alternative social paradigm will need to become hegemonic, we strive in our pedagogical work for a self-consciousness of how we can struggle in solidarity against capital, imperialism, coloniality, and racism. And it's here that the concept of revolutionary practice plays such a prominent role. Now, critical pedagogy for decolonizing democracy means striving within a dialectical space for a unity between existence and consciousness. A unity between existence and consciousness. That is, between actuality, the world as it is, and rationality, human reason as it develops historically in relation to the world. While actuality and rationality obtain in a dialectical relation that's both contradictory and continually changing, Marx takes the position that existence determines consciousness. Of course, Hegel took the position that the laws, patterns, and tendencies discerned by means of scientific study are evidence that rationality has already actualized itself in the world. But Marx didn't believe that the social world reflects the self-realization or actualization of human consciousness or rationality, but that consciousness is a manifestation of the dynamics of the living world. Changes, development, contradictions evidenced in the world can explain changes in corresponding forms of consciousness, ideas, and reason, so that when radical educators posit the desirability of socialism, we do so not on a basis of exercising a value-neutral scientific theory of history, some kind of transcendent morality, or ahistorical theory of social justice, self-realization, and human development, but rather by understanding capitalism's own contradictions and tendencies manifested in changing social relations and forms of consciousness, so that when we postulate an internal and essential rather than an external and contingent relationship between human nature and historical context, we reject relativist and transcendent notions of morality, justice, and fairness in favor of understanding morality, understanding fairness, and understanding justice historically in relation to the needs, the aspirations, and the interests of social classes, relative to given modes of production that have been produced in the context of class struggle. Yet capitalist ideology is not only an effective consciousness of thought, but also it's entombed in the flesh, buried in the sinew and bones of our dreams and the way we think about ourselves and our situatedness in the world. So here I'm talking about building a society of associated producers that will permit the development of our creative powers. And such a struggle will require, in Michael Leibowitz's terms, the simultaneous changing of circumstances and self-change. We build new human beings while we build a new society. Now, I want to just touch on here, I've only got about 10 minutes, I think I've got my hour, coming up to my hour in about 10 minutes. I wanted to talk a little bit about the issue of race, because it's important in its relation to class and how I'm perceiving it. And I will repeat this again. To reduce identity to the experience that people have of their race, class, and gender location is to fail to acknowledge the objective structures of inequality produced by specific historical forces. such as capitalist production relations, that mediate the subjective understandings of both individuals and groups. While relations of oppression on the basis of race, class, and gender invariably intersect, their causes and determinations in capitalist societies can be most effectively traced to the social relations of production, but not reduced to them. Most social relations constitutive of difference are considerably shaped by the relations of production, and that there exists a racialized and gendered division of labor whose severity and function vary depending on where one is located in the capitalist global economy is a commonplace assumption within various schools of Marxism. Contemporary capitalist formations, neo-colonialist, fascist, imperialist, sub-imperialist, are functional for various incarnations of racism, sexism, and patriarchy. It's also true that capitalism can survive in relations of relative racial and gender equality. Capitalism has become multiculturalized after all. One thing is clear: race-based or feminist traditions of struggle are no less important or urgent than class-based ones. What my work attempts to highlight is how class operates as a universal form of exploitation, whose abolition is central to the abolition of all manifestations of oppression. That's the point I'm trying to stress. Class includes a state apparatus whose conquests and regulations create races and shape gender relations. You have to abolish a class-defending state if you want to make real headway in eliminating racism and patriarchy. Clearly, constructions of race and ethnicity are implicated in the circulation and process of variable capital. My work takes the position that forms of oppression based on categories of difference do not possess relative autonomy from class relations, but rather constitute the ways in which oppression is lived and experienced within a class-based system. My work attempts, therefore, to specify how all forms of social oppression function within an overarching capitalist system. Class denotes exploitative relations between people, mediated by the relations to the means of production. This does not mean we reduce race to class or gender to class. We need to see this relation dialectically. So my approach to social struggle is multi-pronged. I choose to organize against racism, sexism, class oppression, white supremacy simultaneously as part of a larger anti-imperialist project directed toward the struggle for socialism. My work on the topic of how race and racism are linked to capitalist social relations argues that forms of non-class domination, such as racism, must often be fought in advance of the class struggle. Certainly we cannot make headway in fighting class oppression without fighting against racism and sexism. And clearly racism and sexism must be fought against, and tirelessly so, despite whether or not we have traced their existence to capitalist relations of exploitation. So I argue for the explanatory primacy of class in examining all forms of domination and exploitation. But that in no way suggests that class struggle is more important than anti-racist struggle or struggles against patriarchy. By arguing that the most powerful contradiction in capitalist society is that between labor and capital, is in no way saying that all we need to do is to bring on the revolution, and racism and sexism and homophobia will somehow all melt away by themselves. That's not going to happen. It's going to take a lot of hard work. Why? Because the criteriologies, because the systems of classification that we use to justify the exploitation of human labor of some people over others, those criteriologies, those languages, right, those systems of classification are going to be there in our lexicon, in our public discourse, in our private language with ourselves, and that has to be rooted out. And that's going to take a long time to root out. You just don't, go, okay, we've seized state power, and now we build, a socialism for the 21st century, and we just sort of, everything else will fall into place. No, absolutely not. Now, I can continue, and I'm not going to, I've got so much written on that. I just want to move to my conclusion right now. And if you want to, we can have a long discussion of that afterwards. I've got a lot of notes on that. Now, the struggle for socialist democracy is admittedly a daunting challenge. especially in the face of global capitalism. And if we acknowledge the fact that 20% of the world population controls 80% of the world's production, and 80% of the people that have access to only 20% of world production, we're compelled to acknowledge this reality is catastrophic. This is the catastrophe of coloniality, the central characteristic of the current world system and the edifice upon which the history of oppression has been constructed. But there's a continuity here that often goes unaddressed. The continuity of colonization is evident in the way the victims of globalization are essentially the same people as the victims in the ex-colonies. Even those who migrate from the periphery of the world system to its center to become slaves. Here I follow Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano in arguing that globalization can best be conceptualized as the development of historical events and ideological constructions which first emerged in the 16th century with the discovery, so-called discovery, of the New World. Quijano maintains that the concept of race is one of those constructs that continues to take on world historical significance, even if not especially today. He draws attention to the production of a world system of classification non-existent before the 16th century, and deftly argues that previous forms of domination, i.e. gender, were then reconfigured around the new system of racial classification. Knowledge and society were organized around the category of race, a precursor to Eurocentrism, to the extent that the division of labor itself was naturalized. This is where I find Ramon's work really important as well. With the help of capitalism, the idea of race helped to yoke the world's population into a hierarchical order of superior and inferior people, and it became a central construct in creating and reproducing the international division of labor, including the global system of patriarchy. Quijano puts it thusly, and I quote, "Domination is the requisite for exploitation, and race is the most effective instrument for domination that, associated with exploitation, serves as a universal classifier in the current global model of power." End of quote. Dualism and evolutionism situated in the European subject as the most spiritually evolved, while women and slaves were viewed as the most primitive. Locked into their corporality, slavery, serfdom, and wage labor and reciprocity all functioned to produce commodities for the world market, and from that period onward, even though it disguised itself as the oxygen of democracy, capitalism became the new general system of exploitation, what Quijano calls a colonial power matrix. Patrón de poder colonial, affecting all dimensions of social existence, such as sexuality, such as authority, such as subjectivity, such as labor. Ramon Grosfoguel conceptualizes a colonial power matrix as a historical, structural, heterogeneous totality that by the late 19th century came to cover the whole planet. Quijano writes, the new historical identities produced around the foundation of the idea of race and the new global structure of the control of labor were associated with social roles and geohistorical places. In this way, both race and the division of labor remain structurally linked and mutually reinforcing, in spite of the fact that neither of them were necessarily dependent on the other in order to exist or change. I think it's a really good insight. In this way, a systematic racial division of labor was imposed. In the Hispanic region, the Crown of Castilla decided early on to end the enslavement of the Indians in order to prevent their total extermination. They were instead confined to serfdom. This is still a quotation by Quijano. For those that lived in communities, the ancient practice of reciprocity, the exchange of labor force and labor without a market, was allowed as a way of reproducing its labor force as serfs. And in some cases, the Indian nobility, a reduced minority, were exempted from serfdom and received special treatment owing to their roles as intermediaries with the dominant race. They were also permitted to participate in some of the activities of the non-noble Spanish. However, blacks were reduced to slavery. As a dominant race, the Spanish and Portuguese whites could receive wages, be independent merchants, independent artisans, or independent farmers, in short, independent producers of commodities. Nevertheless, only nobles could participate in the high to mid-range positions in the military and civil colonial administration. So it's very interesting, these connections that between European patriarchy and European notions of sexuality, epistemology, and spirituality, and how they were exported to the rest of the world through colonial expansion as the hegemonic criteria for racializing, for classifying, for pathologizing the rest of the world's population in a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. Well, we need, obviously, to do more than counter the damage wreaked by capital. We need to seize the conditions afforded us by historically determined possibility to create a society outside of capital's value form. The struggle to build a revolutionary class on the long road to socialism is going to be quite a task. But that struggle must not be one in which we recuperate a Eurocentric center. And that's something that Grossfogel has warned us about. The need, as when he writes, the need for a common language, a common critical language of decolonization, requires a form of universality that is not anymore a monologic, monotopic, imperial global universal design from the right or the left, imposed by persuasion or force to the rest of the world in the name of progress or civilization. This new form of universality I will call a radical, universal, and colonial anti-capitalist universality as a project of liberation. And Grossfogel opposes that to the abstract universals of Eurocentric epistemologies that subsume or dilute the particular into the same. Radical, universal, decolonial, anti-capitalist universality is a concrete universal that builds a decolonial universal by respecting the multiple local particularities of in the struggles against patriarchy, and the struggles against capitalism, and the struggles against coloniality and Eurocentric modernity, from a diversity of decolonial, epistemic, ethical, historical projects. So this is a call for a universal that is a pluriversal, for a concrete universal that would include all the epistemic particularities towards a transmodern, decolonial socialization of power. As the Zapatistas say, luchar por un mundo donde otros mundos sean posibles. There are necessary steps that must be taken both inside and outside of the schooling process to once again dignify the term democracy by taking it away from the neoliberals who conflate the term with the civilizing mission of the West. That white man's burden that has been responsible for so much devastation over the centuries. Critical revolutionary pedagogy does not center its problematic on the discursive ruptures, discontinuities, subjectivism of the politics of different, but instead emphasizes the continuity of capitalist relations of exploitation, maintaining that the struggle for democratic education can be grounded in non-arbitrary conditions. It can be grounded in non-arbitrary conditions. Critical revolutionary educators are careful not to fall prey to this resurrectionary dream of infinite progress that becomes overwhelmed by the spectacle of its own impossibility, joining a resignation to the pulse of history. Instead, we take a principled and non-negotiable stance against exploitation and oppression, one that strives to brush history against the grain of thinking. I think I made it. Any questions? Responses? Do you have a question?
Well, I didn't realize that your question was rhetorical.
Oh,
so
okay.
You said something about capacity building, and just a sentence came in. We need to be held in order to hold ourselves accountable.
Right, right. Yeah, it was rhetorical. Right.
And can I just say that
Sure.
It's wonderful to hear a male person and a white male person talk about subjectivity in a positive light. And I might be like your twin, writing about race and class from a feminist perspective, and not all spiritual people are into the individual. I actually recently attended a talk called Against Cognitive Imperialism, and I'm actually trying to write about a transparent kind of authenticity. And I'm playing with the image of the mandala, work
Yes.
with many centers. So I wanted to take cards with you, and I'm sorry I'm
Absolutely.
obnoxiously self-promoting.
I'd be happy to do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ageism. I didn't hear anything.
Ageism, yeah.
What,
Yeah.
what is society made me that I no longer want to be consumer of vacations, golf, condos?
Right. Right.
Where does ageism fit in?
Ageism, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of isms that I could have added to that. And the list goes on and on. I mean, I think the question for me was that, look, once you ask the question, where are you? And you're able to articulate a preferential option for the oppressed and the exploited in a non-sort of patronizing, condescending way. Then you can begin to engage various languages of understanding. Speciesism was something else too. Speciesism would have been something else that I would like to write about too. There's so many different languages. I mean, you can't, for me, you need to engage what my colleague Henry Giroux calls languages of critique and languages of possibility. And that critical pedagogy is making education relevant in order to make it critical, in order to make it transformative, as Henry would say. And to do that, you need a language, you need multiple languages. For instance, to understand, how society is made you in ways that you no longer want to be. I mean, that comes, largely speaking, you can be self-taught, it can be autodidactic, but it can also occur in the classroom. For instance, if I were to divide this group into 3 groups and to provide a lexicon, operative terms for each group, like the first group I would maybe the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, right? Lacanian terms, right? And the second group I would give the terms, surplus value, variable capital, use value, for instance. Those would be among the dominant terms, which are fairly, classical Marxist terms. And for the third group, I don't know. I gave other terms like ego, id, superego, which would be, Freudian terms, or I could use Jungian terms, the shadow figure, various archetypes, collective unconscious. And I ask you all to go into Oakland and analyze poverty and come back and report on it. Obviously, the terminology that is operative, right, in your language is going to influence the analysis. So you can't teach anybody anything. You can only create conditions for people to learn. And critical educators attempt to bring languages of critique, languages of understanding, some from feminist theory, some from critical theory, Frankfurt School, different languages, various Marxist languages. Language of Marxist humanism is a language that I find very, very powerful and useful in my own work. We attempt to make those available to people so that they can begin to recognize or recognize their experiences. And so all those issues that we're talking about that have to do with age, that have to do with gender, that have to do with sexuality, those are different languages that I can't stipulate what those are going to be. Those have to be made available to young people, to students, to teachers. The language of trauma is a language that I'm trying to look at right now. Just looking at it in terms of my own life, right? Traumatic experiences that I've had. I'm looking at the language now of Jungian psychology that deal with issues of trauma, and finding it very interesting. And that language, I think, has a lot of pedagogical implications with young people who are traumatized by everyday life. Radical educators, critical educators don't really have a language of trauma. how to talk to students about the traumas in their own lives, how to talk to students about their dreams, not just their night dreams, but their daydreams. So, you know, I really believe that we need these kinds of languages, and we need to make them operative in our schools of education in important ways, but I'm not going to stipulate what those are going to be. What I have done in my own work is to fight really bloody hard to make Marxism, you know, a language that teachers, not a language, to take the writings of Marx, let me put it that way, a critique of political economy, the writings of Marx and Marxists, and to make it, make that language a language that teachers will want to engage, rather than just critique without reading it. So that's been my own particular mission, I guess, over the past decade, is to give that language a certain legitimacy within schools of education. And it's not easy, especially in the United States, and especially after 9/11. So that's sort of what I'm attempting to do, is, and the language of class analysis. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to make sense, but let's think about the question that you posed about searching for that perfect society, or trying to achieve it, and also thinking about the tools that are available to us. I would say, for instance, that if you give those three groups, right, the language, even if it is in different cultural languages, they would come up with similar answers. And the reason is because rationality in itself knows no boundaries, knows no distinction in cultures. In other words, they will organize, divide the work, formalize, make rules, regulations, norms, and see who are they going to make classifications of the people that they're going to evaluate or observe. And rationality in itself is creating that process. The whole idea of classification, the whole idea in which all of us in this college have gone through, have been trained to do that. And even the people, the so-called indigenous people, or those who are seeking for decolonizing, are using the same type of language. What would prevent us from, as we obtain that state power, or let's say we get away with the state, but we have some power to create a new society, what would prevent us from going back to mimicking previous structures, coercing other people to adopt or dream society, or prevent us from normalizing the rest of the society?
Great question. Great question. Now, I would agree with you that there would be some things that all three groups would do the same, obviously. You provide groups with a research methodology or a dominant analytical generative terms. That's not going to change everything about the way they think about themselves in the world, right? So you're obviously going to see commonalities across those groups, but some things will be different. Some things will be different, depending on how well the people engaged in the language attempt to understand and be self-reflexive about the theories in which those terminologies are housed. That's number one. But I think your question really is an interesting one, because I would argue that groups that begin to mimic the old colonial structures, or begin to mimic patterns of oppression or patterns of exploitation, is because they really have not attempted to move from the first negation to the second negation. So Raya Dunayevskaya was the founder of Marxist humanist movement. She came from the Ukraine as a young woman, fleeing Stalin. She served as a secretary for Trotsky in Mexico left just before Trotsky was assassinated in Coyoacan. Went to the US and started teaching Hegel and Marx to factory workers. And one of the things that Raya was able to understand, something that actually Lenin began to understand in 1914 in his philosophical notebooks, but didn't really pursue it at the time, was the whole notion of absolute negativity, the negation of the negation. It's not enough to negate. You want to get rid of capitalism, you just don't negate, the capitalists. You negate the very value form in which capital is able to reproduce itself. And absolute negativity becomes the seedbed for the new. Now, it would probably just bore everyone here, except maybe you and me, if I got into the philosophical notions of absolute negativity, largely Hegelian, but it's interesting, some people have attacked the notion of absolute negativity. Not the negative dialectics of Adorno, very different from negativity as Marcuse articulated it, but we're talking about a specific notion of absolute negativity that Raya grounded in Hegel and Marx's critique of Hegel as the seedbed of the new. And some people have said, well, that's pretty Eurocentric to rely on sort of Hegelian philosophy, but the negation of the negation was something that has been traced back to Persia, I think, in 15th century, maybe Persia. It's interesting, there's a lot of sort of seemingly Eurocentric, philosophical notions. Really, you can find them in other, outside of Europe, in long before the Europeans began to champion these concepts and notions. But I would argue that that absolute negativity, the negation of the negation, is one way to go, and that would be very helpful, because in that way we begin to ask the question, why have so many revolutions turned into their opposite? Because they never went beyond the first negation. They had to negate what they've already negated.
Curious as to how your understanding of subjectivity is different, or how do you understand that outside of the postmodern understanding of subjectivity? And then a related question is, what is a difference that is meaningful then?
Well, that's a really good question. I wish I had my notes with me. I don't know if I really understand the concept of subjectivity much differently than sort of post-structuralists might use it, because I do feel that language is a very important site for the formation of human agency. I make strong critiques of post-structuralism in the sense that I'm trying to distinguish sort of the traps of post-structuralism from the traps of other, theoretical perspectives, and to warn people about that sort of where that goes politically. But I'm not so sure that my notion of, radical post-structuralists would probably argue that there's no such thing as critical self-reflexivity. You can't, that basically it's language, the fact that subjectivity is located and grounded primarily in language disables you from being really critically self-reflexive. The issue for me, of course, is the issue that you mentioned. What is the difference that makes a difference, right? And so for me, simply posing the question of people are always saying, well, diversity is a good thing. The question for me is, well, diversity for what? Difference for what? Difference in whose interests? Difference for what purpose? And I don't, it's like the old question of art for art's sake. Really? Art for what purpose? Art in whose interests? Those are issues that I think are very, very important. Would you like to, can I give you some stuff? Send you some stuff on that?
Yes, I'd be very interested in that.
Looks like our time is up, and I want to say thank you very, very much. Very important announcements.
Yes, we got announcements. Well, the first announcement is that we're hoping that Peter will come back in the fall and stay with us for a little bit longer and perhaps hold a seminar of a longer period of time, right?
I'd love to.
So that is the first sort of like announcement, and maybe we can get some help to try to organize that. Want to also make sure to thank and acknowledge everyone who's helped here. Our wonderful staff and our wonderful students who participate and help us, in the Graduate School of Education for their support as well, and invite you to our next event. It's a historical event. It's our Cinco de Mayo celebration, and we organize that around a conversation about what happened and why we continue to remember that event. But more of that on El Cinco de Mayo. So I want to also invite you to come to step outside into the parlor, and we have a space there for continued conversation around some goodies. Okay, and then thank you all for coming and for being interested and willing to engage in difficult, complex, and exciting, but also incredibly doable and inspiring future conversations. So thank you very much, Peter, again.